Much for the opportunity to speak today. What I really wanted to talk about today is my research quite broadly, and then how really how we need better data to enable this innovation in future textiles to come through. So just to give you a sense of who I am and what I do, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background into my work. So I am a textile expert and a knit specialist. I worked for many years as a teaching fellow in the School of Design at the University of Leeds. What I was doing there was I was really interested in kind of positioning knit as the kind of foundational textile process to take textiles out into different industries and specifically to scale up to kind of architectural applications. And also within that, to think about how knit could become a responsive and programmable material system. So there's definitely interest in my work in scale, in materials, and in functionality, and in taking knit into these kind of new areas. And in 2020, I got the opportunity to move from Leeds to join Newcastle University. And what I did there was actually join a really interesting new research hub called the Hub for Biotechnology in the Built Environment. And HBBE, as we call it, is a really interesting kind of cross-institutional research hub working with architecture and engineering at Newcastle and biosciences at Northumbria. So it's fundamentally interdisciplinary and bringing together lots of kind of experts from different areas. And the field of biotech is really growing in so many different sectors that this was an opportunity to really think about what happens if we try and scale some of this biotech to the built environment. And I came in to think about how textiles could be used within this space as a method to scaffold and scale some of the innovation that was happening in the lab up to a building or a kind of a room scale. So just really briefly, because I think it's kind of important to understand where I'm coming from, how the hub was structured is across 4 research themes. So we had building metabolism, living construction, microbial environments, and responsible interactions, each of which kind of interact with each other but have a very specific purpose. So building metabolism, very much thinking about the building as a system, so as a kind of closed system, and how a building could be used to process its own waste, to kind of regenerate its own resource. Living construction, thinking about how you grow materials for the construction industry and for architecture. Microbial environments, thinking about the microbiome of a building, essentially. So what is happening within the microbial communities inside the built environment, and how can you design healthier microbial environments. And responsible interactions was developed because we realised that there were kind of ethics and responsibilities of working with living organisms in the built environment. And then what happened in last year, at the beginning of last year, was living textiles was actually identified as a 5th theme, which is obviously fantastic because it just showed kind of how the work had progressed to get its own kind of vision within this space. And really what I was trying to do was think about designing with biology using textile materials, textile thinking, and then advanced textile technologies. And I would say that textiles definitely cross-cut all the other themes. So whilst it is its own theme, it definitely interacts with all the others. As I mentioned to begin with, it's very much interdisciplinary, and there are these incredible researchers that lead the different groups that I've been privileged to kind of work on projects alongside. So there's a very diverse field of specialists within the hub, and my own research and then the research of my PhD students is how kind of textiles has really become integrated in kind of a very fundamental way. So what are we doing in living textiles? We're doing 2 things really. We're thinking about how textiles can be a really fundamental way to scale up a whole range of biofabrication processes to the built environment. And then we're also thinking about, what could we use biotechnology for to think about sustainability and circularity in future textiles. There's these kind of 2 aspects that I'm constantly looking at in the projects that we're working on. It's absolutely clear that we do span these scales. So the projects that the Living Textiles team are engaged in are working kind of across the kind of scope of research in this group, from the biological scale all the way up to the industry scale. And I think textiles is pretty unique in being able to transcend this kind of scale of activity. So it's very interesting that on the one hand, we're engaged in back to baselines project, which is really looking at systems change and industry change. And then actually at a project level, we're looking at what the impact of that might be if we're trying to functionalize a fiber or develop a new protein coating system. So it kind of spans that whole range of kind of research activities. And what I thought I'd focus on today is kind of looking at the kind of process and picking off some key ideas within the kind of process that we might be able to really think about what data is missing and what we might need a bit more of going forward. So this is my circular biofabrication process, and this is kind of the ideal method for me in really thinking about where biotech could take us for biotextiles in the future. And in a way, and it's based on obviously a lot of great data and concepts coming through from both design and technology looking at this area. But I think what's really interesting is that we start from waste as our resource. So we really think about how can we use waste streams to feed our new biotech processes. And then what are those materials that we're developing? There's kind of two aspects. There's both to create these circular materials and sustainable materials. Yes, we need to be thinking about maybe biosynthesis of new fibers and new materials, but we also need to think about those biological coatings and whether we can reduce the kind of chemical input at the treatment stage as well. I'm very passionate about the idea that if we're making new materials, we need to be really thinking about their functionality and really thinking about advancing the functionality of the things that we're creating. So the aim is always to kind of add value through functionalization. And I think what the implication of that is quite often that we might actually need new processing techniques in order to kind of develop these new materials. And that's quite interesting in itself. How does the conventional textile industry kind of associate itself with the new biotech textiles industry? Are these two separate industries, or actually are there opportunities for them kind of to merge and learn from each other? Or can we fit biotech into the industry we already have? And I think fundamental to the whole thing is this idea that we are programming the design from a circular perspective, so that we're thinking about this closed loop from the beginning. So there's huge growth in research focused on developing some really completely new types of textiles. Just to give you an example of some of the things that are happening, we've got huge growth in research looking at bacterial cellulose, which is a pure cellulose produced by bacteria, and also looking at materials made from mycelium. Bacterial cellulose is a really interesting one. I put on Biocouture as one of the kind of precedents, just because of the kind of importance of Suzanne Lee's work back in 2003. I think the work started. So to show that this isn't really kind of new, but it's definitely a developing field. And then the innovations that are coming through from people like Modern Synthesis, who are really thinking about what do you need to add to this material? What textile processes can really enhance the functionality of a bacterial cellulose for the textile industry? Alongside that, there's a huge increase in interest and work and development looking at mycelium as a leather-like material, and really successful examples of these materials coming through into industry at a kind of a really high level, which is very exciting to see that actually kind of the development of the material and the processes are able to align to make these products really commercially successful. And so I guess from our perspective in a research environment, what are we thinking of doing that's going beyond these kind of commercially driven applications? And one thing that I mentioned previously was this idea about functionalizing the materials and actually thinking about how we can use biology to transform those properties. And this image is just showing some examples of how that might happen. So from the example of bacterial cellulose, the image at the top shows how we can scale that material. So actually we could grow bacterial cellulose sheets at a scale. This example was a scale suitable for kind of a 2.5 meter panel. We can change how the material is produced through different biological processes. So either producing a sheet-like material or producing essentially pellets, depending on how they're grown. Really interesting work that we did through the Fibre Future projects was to think about how we could integrate, how we could change the properties of bacterial cellulose to improve their performance. So bacterial cellulose is very hydrophilic, it's very water-loving. But obviously for most applications, you want to have a hydrophobic material, so you don't want it just to absorb water exponentially. And so this was about, could we look at a protein that would actually produce a hydrophobic coating on these fabrics? And as a kind of additional function, how did that coating affect the fire retardancy of the material? And in fact, we found that these biological treatments can really enhance the properties of these materials as we want to take them through into industry. And I think what's interesting here from a data perspective is to think about this as a completely new industry. And if it is a new industry, how does it compare with the conventional textile industry? Is this something we can integrate into conventional manufacturing? And how does it compare? And I think the impact of these processes is perhaps something that's not that well understood at the moment. But I think it's very interesting that actually the PI on this project, Meng Zhang, with a colleague at Northumbria, is through Impact Plus funding, looking at full LCA analysis for bacterial cellulose produced using different methods. And so hopefully that will give some really nice data to to underline the potential of these new materials coming through. So instead of designing the whole process, we can also use this relationship between textiles and microbes to create new functions. And the kind of second body of work that I'm really interested in is the interaction between textiles and microbes. And the first project that we looked at in this area was actually from some previous work that Angie had been doing. So this is collaborations with Dr. Angela Sherry, who's a microbial ecologist at Northumbria University. And she'd been really interested in looking at bacteria for biodegradation of hydrocarbon after oil spills. And she'd seen some interesting data around the use of human hair, to try and prevent these spills. And so we wondered how we could actually design a system rather than just using this farm material. Was there potential to really understand the relationship between the textiles and the microbes and how they could be working together to kind of create this bioremediation function? And the project that we actually, I'm just going to press play here, the project that we actually developed was thinking about how we could program a textile at a macro scale and the behavior of bacteria at a micro scale to produce this kind of very functional material that could deliver hydrocarbon degrading microbes to the place that they were needed to degrade hydrocarbon after an oil spill. So it was a really interesting project that was looking at kind of right across the scale from bacteria up to programming fabrics, and seeing how kind of textiles could be positioned within this this system. And so we were using Pseudomonas pseudica to translocate around the liquid layer. And we found that what was particularly interesting about this, I think, is that it was very much fibre dependent. So we couldn't just use any textile. We needed to know what kind of textiles we were working with in order to make this system work. And so really, I think that's where what I would say is the key impact here is we needed to know what resource we were using. So where could more data help? We wouldn't want, you wouldn't want to use high cost or high value textile materials, particularly to be working with remediation. But if you know what they're made of, you can design a system to work directly with the bacteria and with the remediation. So it's really key to have the right resource to use here. And this idea of being very tailored into a specific resource also feeds into the next microbe textile interaction project that I'm currently working on with Max, who's on this call, which is Fabriotic. And that is thinking about using microbes in a very different way to functionalize fabrics. So this is thinking about a very particular problem, which is a problem around longevity of sportswear clothing, and whether we could introduce biotics, as in bacterial systems, to actually work on some of the problems around permastink, so clothing that you can't remove the smell from once it gets impregnated into the clothing, through kind of living organisms, through a living system, I guess I would say. And we think there's huge impact of doing this, particularly around longevity of clothing, because evidence shows that people dispose of their clothing simply because of smell that they can't remove. So we can lengthen the lifespan of clothing by this kind of intervention. And again, for this process to work, what we've done is to look very particularly at one fibre type. So we're using polyester in this study, and we want to understand the relationship between the biotics and the fibres in order to be able to adhere our biotics onto the textiles, in order to understand how they are responding to multiple washes, multiple wears, and actually what's happening to the fabrics afterwards. So I think what's interesting here is this idea that by kind of diving into one fibre type, we can actually demonstrate some really interesting findings that maybe have impact elsewhere, but definitely can impact on that sector. One finding that I think is very interesting of this project is actually that we're really interested in the consumer perspective. What do people think of the idea of biotics in clothing? We know biotics are accepted in food and in other sectors, but actually we think there's a real gap in data around consumer perception of biotics. And again, as another project that's coming through the Impact Plus funding, will look very much from a social sciences perspective, or I'll be involved in this project from a social sciences perspective, to understand kind of whether there are what the opportunity is and what people think about whether they would want to wear these kind of biotic clothes. So that's a really interesting project that's coming up soon. I've talked quite a lot about waste, and waste is kind of where my projects should start and end, is this idea of how we can extract resource from waste. And one of the pieces of work that I've been doing over the last 12 months was to try and understand from a local perspective, because it's kind of a national issue, it feels a bit difficult to kind of get to grips with. So it felt like a good opportunity to think about what's happening here, what's happening in Newcastle, and how can we start to understand the kind of waste, the picture of textile waste. What data do we actually have? What can we use? And, you know, are these ideas about biological processing feasible? Do we have the kind of resource there to use? And it was really interesting when we started to talk to the council about this, because they have some kind of push and pull. They really want to transform how residents think about waste. They were very clear about that, and they want people to see waste textiles as a resource rather than just something to dispose of. And so their perspective very much is about thinking about how could we develop behaviour change. How can we encourage reuse and recycling? They work very closely with British Heart Foundation, who are their kind of partners in textiles, to try and reuse as much of the local textile waste as possible. But on the flip side, if garments or textiles are not reusable, there is no collection of textile waste. So textiles just go into the general municipal waste. So we thought that was really interesting, that kind of on the one hand, there's a vision to have this resource, textiles as a resource to reuse, but actually at the moment, there isn't the capacity to do that. And textiles are going into municipal waste, and they're not particularly liked in municipal waste because they're quite difficult to deal with. The council also felt that, you know, this will change, or there will be even bigger drive to do something about textile waste with the UK emissions trading scheme in 2028, which will increase the disposal cost for synthetic textiles, so where they're disposing of synthetic textiles. So there was kind of this picture of real excitement around what could we do with it, but the reality is actually the data isn't there to understand what's being diverted, what's being landfilled, and how can we actually, how can we get a much clearer picture of that data, which I thought was fascinating, because actually, from my perspective, that's the kind of key resource we need to understand. What I wanted to finish on, because I realise I've kind of done 20 minutes already, but I think it's quite nice, is kind of an example of some work that we've done where we've looked at our own ecosystem and we've looked at our own waste strategy to try and kind of close those gaps and give a snapshot of what maybe we can do in the space of textiles biotechnology for the built environment. So thinking about new applications as well. I call this living textile ecosystems. So going back to biotech for the built environment, we've done a lot of work with mycelium and developing mycelium composites using textiles. So these slides here, in case people don't know about mycelium, it's the vegetative part of fungus or mushrooms. So the mushroom or the fungus is the fruiting body, and the mycelium is the bit that's growing through the ground. And it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. As it grows, it develops this really complex network of hyphae, of little root-like structures, which can bind to and derive nutrient from a range of cellulose-rich materials. And so what you get, as you can see in the middle image, is this new material that's a composite of the mycelium, which is the white bits, whatever the substrate is, which here is sawdust, and then we bind them onto wool. And so there's this great opportunity to actually think about mycelium as a kind of an active agent in developing new biotech textiles for the built environment. We've done quite a lot of work on this, and we've looked at two key routes. So we've trying to develop the thinking around this whole idea of a circular biosystem and to develop two key routes. And depending on the kind of emphasis of the work or where you're kind of putting the key decision making, there's two routes that we've looked at. So we've either looked at a route which we call which is kind of BioKnit, which is quite dependent on amazing current technologies. And then we have another route, which is developed through the living room, which I'll show you in a minute, which is very much focused on resource. So we've got these two models, which I did discuss at the beginning, where either we look to resource and we focus on that, or actually we really embrace the kind of incredible technologies we've got in the textile industry. So this is the BioKnit route, using our 3D knit technology, so using computation, and using data, very much data-driven on performance, on the physics, on simulating structures. We're able to grow these really precise mycelium bio textile composites. And this example here of the arch, actually the kind of geometries of the structure were so precise that it was able to just be supported by 6 screw heads in the design museum and then sit on the balustrade. So it's a really high performance and highly sophisticated biofabrication strategy. Fantastic. But when we analyse what we're actually using to produce this, the resources aren't local. So the mycelium is fantastic. It's a very quick growing mycelium, which is used for a lot of biofabrication. And it particularly likes growing on beechwood sawdust. But obviously, where we are in the north of England, that's not the kind of substrate that we would grow locally, or grow and process locally. So we really started thinking about how could we tailor this biofabrication, with better understanding of resource? Could we tailor this kind of biofabrication to kind of a more regional perspective? And we were very fortunate to have the opportunity to deliver an installation that was particularly looking at that. So how can we challenge the way we conceive, make and experience architecture in response to the challenge of the climate emergency? And so what we decided to do with our research here was to go back to resource and to think about what's available locally and to just grow from a waste resource. So we looked at local wools as a byproduct of the meat industry, of fleeces that were less processed and wouldn't be processed up into yarns. We also found sawdust from the local kind of wood production industry and also paper from the local papermaking industry. So we were really able to kind of tailor all the resource that we wanted to use to a local strategy. But what we found, which I think is fascinating with this resource, is actually it was more appropriate to come away from technology when we were developing this and to really use almost a craft-based way of understanding material and learning through the experience of working with these materials. And to work with these materials to grow structures at an architectural scale. So it really made us kind of reconsider a lot of the kind of technology-driven and industry-driven approaches that we've been working with. But actually what we produced in the end was this really kind of compelling installation, which still was absolutely a mycelium textile biocomposite. So the same kind of material composition, but a different aesthetic and a different way of producing it. And so my kind of final comments to you, and my final ideas is really, I think the idea of waste as a resource is very powerful, but we need to know a lot more about the waste we're using. In all of the projects I've presented, it's really key to understand not only fibre composition, but also what other treatments, what other dyes, what other finishing has happened to the textile waste before we can use biology to transform it. The second thing I think is really interesting is if we see this vision of textiles in the future, what happens to the technology and the industry that we have? Do technologies adapt, or do we adapt our technology to work alongside industry? I think there's huge opportunities when we're thinking about specific functionalities to use nature-based solutions. And I think that's something to kind of to really think about, is actually very focused research around a specific problem that we want to solve. I think for us, actually, the next stage is to think about consumers, about their acceptance of these new materials, about how they make decisions around purchasing, around disposal. And so actually, I think there's a huge piece of work that needs to be done to understand about consumer behaviour. And then finally, I'd say that joining up the industry, so thinking about textiles plus biotech plus construction, really means more data is required, and it's data from all of those different sectors that's going to be necessary to kind of make the change that we really want to see. The final slide was to leave you with, finally, to get to some data. And this is about the built environment, because I think it's really compelling to think about the problems in other sectors when we think about the problems in textiles, because actually one of the key problems in the construction sector is around the embodied carbon in materials. And, I found this really distressing when I read from the most recent global status report that the goals for building and construction are out of reach, and so something radical needs to be done. And I actually think that if we can think about joining up these industries and seeing waste resource from one sector to become the feedstock and the resource for another, perhaps there are kind of opportunities to make meaningful change. Thank you very much.